Welcome to Sinister Truths, the place where forgotten horrors crawl back into the light. Tonight we're stepping into a nightmare that still haunts Baton Rouge. A story so twisted that even seasoned historians whisper it instead of saying it out loud. In the sweltering summer of 1848, on a sprawling sugar plantation just outside the Red River, something unspeakable happened. 40 enslaved people vanished without a trace in a single night. No bodies, no graves, no explanations. Only blood-stained shackles swinging in the morning breeze and a silence that swallowed an entire plantation. This is the most disturbing slave mystery in Baton Rouge history, and what really happened that night has been buried for 177 years. If you're ready to uncover a secret darker than the bayou at midnight, smash that like button right now. Turn on notifications and drop a comment telling me. Which country are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? And while you're down there, hit subscribe to Sinister Truths so you never miss the darkest stories history tried to erase. Now, let's descend into the horror. The year is 1848, and the air over Baton Rouge hangs so thick with heat and sweetness that a man can taste the cane before he ever sees the fields. Along the winding banks of the Mississippi, just a few miles upriver from the growing city, stands Belle Plantation, one of the grandest, richest, and most merciless estates in the entire South. To the steamboat captains gliding past on the river, it looked like a white palace floating above a green ocean of sugarcane. 70-foot columns, wide galleries, mirrored parlors, chandeliers imported from Paris, and gardens laid out with the precision of Versailles. Visitors from New Orleans called it the jewel of Louisiana. Enslaved people who survived it called it something else entirely, the place where souls went to be fed upon. The Whitmore family had owned the land since the Spanish grants of the 1790s, but it was Henry Ware Whitmore, known simply as Mr. Henry to anyone who valued their skin, who turned Belle Grove into a sugar empire. By 1848 he was 43 years old, tall, thin, and pale as printer's paper, with ice-gray eyes that never seemed to blink long enough for a person to feel safe. They said he could smile while ordering a man lashed until the bones of his back showed, and the smile never slipped. His wife, Delphine Whitmore, was rarely seen outside the great house. Rumor held that she spent her days in a darkened bedroom reading French novels and drinking laudanum laced with absinthe. Their only surviving son, 16-year-old Absalom, had already learned to carry a horsewhip the way other boys carried fishing poles. The plantation sprawled across nearly 7,000 acres, producing over 2,000 hogsheads of sugar a year, an almost obscene fortune. To achieve that yield, the cane had to be cut, crushed, and boiled within hours of harvest, which meant work never stopped. Not for Christmas, not for Easter, not for funerals. The great grinding mill, powered by a 60-horse steam engine imported from Pittsburgh, roared day and night during grinding season, its scream carrying for miles across the swamps. Enslaved children as young as 5 were sent into the fields at dawn with sacks almost as big as themselves. By dusk, many could not stand straight. Women who had just given birth were back cutting cane within days, their infants tied to nearby stalks in the shade of broad leaves that offered no real relief from the 110-degree heat. The overseers, 6 white men and 1 free man of color who had sold his own soul for a salary, carried 9-tail whips soaked in brine. A single lash would split skin like overripe fruit. But cruelty alone does not explain why Belle Grove felt different from even the harshest neighboring estates. Something in the soil itself seemed poisoned with memory. The land had been a Tunica Indian burial ground long before the French arrived, and old people in Baton Rouge still spoke of strange fires seen dancing over the fields on moonless nights. Runaways who made it to freedom in New Orleans carried stories no one wanted to repeat in daylight. Screams that rose from beneath the earth after midnight, pale shapes moving between the rows of cane, the way dogs refused to enter certain parts of the plantation even when whipped. One man, a driver named Scipio who escaped in 1845, told abolitionists in Philadelphia that on some nights the cane itself seemed to bleed when cut, and that he had seen Mr. Henry walk alone into the fields carrying a lantern that burned with a green flame no wind could extinguish. The slave quarters, 60 rough cabins arranged in 2 grim rows behind the main house, were built on low ground that flooded every spring. Water moccasins nested in the walls. Malaria and dysentery took 1 in 5 children before the age of 10. Yet even here, in the place meant to break the spirit fastest, something resisted. Secret worship continued under the cover of night. Old African songs were sung in whispers that carried the cadence of languages white ears could not decipher. A woman named Tante Marguerite, said to be over 100 years old and blind in both eyes, served as the community's conjurer. She kept a small pot of dirt taken from Africa itself beneath her bed, and could heal a fever with a murmured prayer or lay a curse that made an overseer's hand wither overnight. People said she had been born in Saint-Domingue before the Great Revolution and had walked across half the world carrying the old gods in her memory. Children were warned never to look directly into the empty sockets of her eyes, because those who did sometimes disappeared into the cane and were never seen again. Discipline at Belle Grove was not merely harsh, it was theatrical. Punishments were staged in the yard between the great house and the quarters so that every soul, field hand, house servant, or visiting gentleman from Baton Rouge, could witness what happened to the disobedient. The whipping post was a thick cypress log sunk deep into the ground and polished smooth by the blood and skin of hundreds. Beside it stood the nigger breaker, an iron cage barely large enough for a grown man to crouch inside. Victims were left there for days under the sun with only a cup of water. Mr. Henry kept a notebook in which he recorded every infraction and every punishment with the meticulousness of a banker balancing ledgers. Lucy, 22 lashes for slow hoeing. Samson, 3 days in the breaker for looking at his dead child's corpse for mourning too loud. Eve, thumbscrews for spilling coffee on Mrs. Whitmore's dress. The notebook still exists, locked away in a university archive, its pages warped and brown. Yet the deepest terror was reserved for those who tried to run. The swamps around Belle Grove were a maze of water and cypress knees patrolled by bloodhounds, bred specially for the task. Their handler, a scarred Irishman named Cullen who had once been transported for murder in County Cork, bragged that his dogs could follow a scent across water. Few runaways made it more than a mile before the bayou. Those who were caught were brought back alive if possible. Mr. Henry liked to make an example. One man, Big Isaac, was hamstrung in front of the assembled quarters, both Achilles' tendons sliced clean through, so that he would never run again. He was then forced to sit at the gate every day ringing the bell for work, a living warning. He died 2 years later, when infection reached his heart, but not before teaching every child on the place what the white man could do to black flesh and still keep it breathing. House servants fared little better. They lived under the constant eyes of the Whitmores and were punished for the slightest imperfection. A dropped plate, a smudge on a mirror, a sigh too loud. Any could earn a slap from Delphine's ivory fan, or a night locked in the cellar with the rats. The cook, a woman named Aunt Phoebe, had her front teeth knocked out with a silver ladle for oversalting the soup. Yet these same house slaves knew the family's darkest secrets, the locked room on the 3rd floor where no one was allowed, the strange parcels that arrived from New Orleans addressed to Mr. Henry in handwriting no one recognized, the way Absalom sometimes wandered the halls at night speaking to empty air in a language that sounded like French spoken backward. By the summer of 1848, the plantation had reached a kind of unholy perfection. The cane stood taller than a man on horseback, heavy with juice. The mills screamed without cease. Profits had never been higher. Mr. Henry had just purchased 20 new slaves at the Baton Rouge slave pens, strong men and women in the prime of life, including a young woman named Celeste, who could sing in a voice so beautiful that even the overseers sometimes paused to listen. No one knew it yet, but the machinery of wealth and terror had been running so smoothly, so flawlessly, that something ancient beneath the fields had begun to stir. The debt that had been accruing unseen for half a century was almost due, and the land itself was getting hungry. The enslaved people felt it first: restless sleep, dreams of being pulled downward through black water, the sudden silence of birds at midday. Tante Marguerite stopped speaking entirely for 3 days, sitting outside her cabin and rocking with her arms wrapped around her knees. When she finally opened her mouth again, all she would say was, 40. It coming for 40. No one understood what she meant. Not yet. On the great house gallery, Mr. Henry stood in his white linen suit, sipping Madeira, and watching the sun sink red into the cane. He felt nothing but satisfaction. The crop was magnificent. The slaves were obedient. His fortune grew by the hour. He did not notice the way the shadows between the rows seemed to move against the wind, or how the bloodhounds had begun to whine and cower when led past a certain section of the back fields after dusk. He did not hear the low, rhythmic thumping that had started far beneath the earth, like a heart beginning to beat after centuries of silence. Belle Grove Plantation, jewel of Louisiana, palace of sugar and sorrow, was beautiful and rotting from the inside, stood poised on the edge of a night no one would ever forget. 40 souls lived and worked and suffered within its boundaries, never imagining that in a few short weeks their names, their pain, their very existence would be erased so completely that even the wind would refuse to speak them ever again. And the land waited, patient, ancient, insatiable, counting down the days. The night of August 17th, 1848 came in like a living thing. It had been a punishing day, even by Belle Grove standards. The temperature had climbed past 105 degrees before noon, and the air was so saturated that sweat refused to evaporate. It simply rolled down faces and spines and pooled inside boots until every step sounded like walking through warm broth. Thunderheads had been stacking themselves against the western sky all afternoon. Purple-black towers shot through with green lightning. But the rain held off, as though the storm itself was reluctant to touch the plantation. By sunset the cane fields looked bruised, the leaves hanging limp and metallic. The enslaved people came in from the back acreage in silence, too spent even for the low hymns that usually sung on the long walk to the quarters. Children stumbled and were carried. One woman, 7 months pregnant, collapsed halfway and had to be dragged the rest of the way by her wrists. The overseer laughed and told her the exercise would make the baby come out stronger. Supper was cornmeal mush and salt pork rind, served in dented tin pans. Most ate standing up because sitting took energy they no longer possessed. Tante Marguerite moved among the cabins, passing out sips of bitter willow bark tea for the malaria that had already begun to bloom in half the quarters. She touched foreheads, whispered prayers in a language that mixed Congo with Creole French, and every time she passed a doorway she paused, tilted her blind face toward the fields, and shook her head as though listening to something no one else could hear. When little Celeste, the new girl with the voice like a nightingale, asked what was wrong, the old woman only pressed a finger to the girl's lips and said only, "Count the thunder, child, count careful." By 9 o'clock the heat still had not broken. The quarters were a haze of tobacco smoke, sweat, and the sweet rot smell of bodies packed too close. Mosquitoes swarmed in black clouds, so thick that people kept small fires of damp leaves burning inside the cabins just to make a barrier of smoke. Mothers fanned infants with palmetto leaves. Men sat on the dirt floors oiling cracked feet or silently sharpening the blades of cane knives that were supposed to be turned in each night but never were. In one cabin a young Samson told the story of Brer Rabbit and the tar baby for the 10th time that week, pitching his voice low so the patrollers wouldn't hear and come with the whip. Laughter was rare, but when it came it was soft, like something precious being passed hand to hand in the dark. At 10 o'clock the sky finally tore open. The first crack of thunder was so loud it rattled the tin cups on their pegs. Rain came sideways, driven by a wind that smelled of river mud and something metallic. Lightning turned the world, white over and over again, freezing everything in strobes. The rows of cane bent almost double, the great house glowing like a lantern on its hill, the faces of the people in the doorways, eyes wide, mouths open, hair plastered to skulls. Children screamed and were hushed. Dogs howled until the overseers kicked them quiet. Within minutes, the yard between the cabins had become a shallow lake. Water ran red-brown with clay, carrying away the day's filth and uncovering shards of pottery, animal bones, and once the rusted iron collar of some long-dead runaway. The storm was not ordinary. Even the oldest people said they had never felt lightning so close, never heard thunder that seemed to come from under the ground as well as above it. Every flash revealed the same thing, the cane fields moving wrong, as though something large was passing between the rows faster than any man could run. No one spoke of it aloud, but hands reached for hands in the dark, and mothers pulled children deeper into the cabins. At 11 o'clock sharp, the overseer, Josiah Rankin, made his final round. Rankin was a thick-necked man from Mississippi with a face like a butcher's block and a lantern that burned whale oil so old it stank of death. He was drunk, everyone could smell the corn whiskey on him, but not so drunk he would risk Mr. Henry's rage by skipping the count. He moved down the rows banging on each door with the butt of his whip, shouting the same words every night. All in, or I'll have the hide off ya." Inside each cabin someone answered, "All here, boss," because that was the rule, one voice for all. Rankin peered through the bars of the tiny windows, saw the huddled shapes on the cornshuck pallets, marked his tally board, and moved on. 40 souls. 40 exactly, because 2 weeks earlier a boy named Jonah had died of the flux and no replacement had yet come from the pens. Rankin locked the hasp on the outside of each door, thick oak with iron bands, and dropped the heavy padlock through. The locks clicked like teeth. When he reached the last cabin, he paused. Something felt off. The rain was louder here, almost like a roar, and the ground seemed to shiver under his boots. He swung the lantern high. For one heartbeat, the light caught a shape at the edge of the cane, tall, thin, wrong-jointed, before the darkness swallowed it again. Rankin cursed, shook his head to clear the whiskey, and told himself it was a trick of the storm. He trudged back toward the white folks' quarters, boots sucking in the mud, muttering that he'd be damned if he'd stay out in this deluge 1 second longer than he had to. Behind him, the quarters fell silent except for the storm and the soft, continuous sound of praying. Inside the locked cabins, people tried to sleep. The dirt floors had turned to mud, water seeped under the doors and rose around the pallets. Mothers stacked children on top of trunks to keep them dry. The air was so thick with moisture it felt like breathing soup. Somewhere a baby cried itself to exhaustion. In the third cabin from the end, Celeste began to sing, not loud, just a thread of melody to calm the smallest children. It was an old lullaby from the Sea Islands, something about a bird that carried sleeping babies across the water to a place where no whip ever fell. One by one, the other cabins took up the song, voice answering voice through the walls, until the quarters were filled with that fragile, aching harmony. Even the thunder seemed to pause to listen. Then, at the stroke of midnight, the singing stopped as though a hand had been clamped over every mouth at once. No one ever agreed on exactly what they heard first. Some said it was a sound like wet cloth being torn, slow and deliberate. Others swore it was the padlocks clicking open by themselves, one after another, pop, pop, pop down the row faster than any human hand could move. A few insisted they heard whispering, not in any language they knew, but in tones that made the spine loosen in the body. What everyone agreed on was the sudden, impossible cold that poured into the cabins, a cold so intense that breath fogged in August, that water on the floor began to skim with ice. Lanterns guttered and went out, though there was no wind inside the locked rooms. In that darkness, something brushed against the walls, not knocking, but stroking, as though testing the wood for weakness. Panic took the quarters like fire through dry cane. People surged toward the doors and found them standing wide open, rain slashing in sideways, yet no one had touched the locks. The hasps hung twisted and snapped away green wood breaks. Women screamed for their children. Men grabbed cane knives and hoes. Someone shouted that the overseers were playing a cruel joke, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were lies. No joke ever smelled like that. Like wet earth turned inside out, like a grave opened after 100 years. They spilled into the yard 40 strong, some barefoot, some carrying babies, some clutching nothing but the rags on their backs, and stopped dead. The storm had paused at its height. Rain still fell, but straight down now, each drop fat and deliberate. Lightning froze the world every few seconds, and in those flashes showed a sight that drove the breath from lungs already burning with terror. The yard was empty of everything but themselves. No overseers, no dogs, no white faces at the windows of the great house. And in the mud, impossible, impossible. There were no footprints except the ones they were making right then. The ground might as well have been concrete for all the mark the night had left on it. Then came the second wave of horror. One by one, starting with the cabin nearest the cane field, people realized their iron shackles, the ones some still wore at night as extra punishment, were broken, not cut, not filed, broken. The links lay in the mud, snapped cleanly in half, the metal ends splayed outward like flower petals made of iron. Big Isaac, whose ankles had been chained together for 7 years since his failed escape, stared down at his feet as though they belonged to someone else. When he lifted one leg, the two halves of the shackle fell away with a wet clank. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. Celeste was the first to see the blood. It was not a splash or a trail. It was a perfect circle, 10 feet across, in the exact center of the yard. The rain should have washed it away in seconds, but it stayed, dark and glossy, reflecting the lightning like a black mirror. At the edges, the mud had been pressed down in radiating grooves, as though something with claws the size of a man's arm had dug in for purchase, and in the middle of the circle lay a single object no one wanted to name at first, a human heart, freshly torn, still faintly steaming in the cold. That was when the screaming started in earnest. People ran in every direction and no direction. Some bolted for the main road only to find the gate standing open and the road itself swallowed by a mist that glowed faintly green. Others plunged into the cane, the sharp leaves slicing skin already raw from the day's work. Mothers who had lost children in the chaos screamed names into the storm until their voices shredded. Men with cane knives formed hasty circles, backs together, blades out, eyes rolling white with fear. Lightning kept giving them snapshots, here a cabin door hanging from one hinge, there a child's rag doll floating in the blood circle, everywhere the sense that the night itself was watching, and beneath it all, growing louder, was that thumping. Like a heart, Tante Marguerite had said, but larger than any heart had a right to be. It came up through the soles of the feet, through the bones of the legs, through the teeth. With every beat the temperature dropped another degree. Frost began to form on the broken shackles. No one saw it take the first person. They only knew that one moment a woman named Rose was standing at the edge of the circle clutching her 2-year-old son, and the next moment she was simply gone. No cry, no splash. Only the sudden absence where a living woman had stood, and the child left floating a foot above the mud, lowered gently as though by invisible hands before it began to wail. Then another flash, a man vanished mid-stride while running for the river levee, leaving his hat spinning in place like a top. Each time it happened, the circle of blood pulsed brighter, and the cane at the edges of the yard bent inward as though bowing. The 40 souls of Belle Grove did not die that night. That would have been mercy. They were unmade, one by one, then faster, like corn popping in a hot pan. They disappeared, some while screaming, some in utter silence. The last to go was Tante Marguerite. She stood in the middle of the yard long after every other soul had vanished, rain washing rivers down her ancient face, arms outstretched. She was smiling, not the smile of the mad, but of someone who has finally understood a long, complicated joke. Lightning cracked directly overhead, turning her white hair into a halo of fire. And in that white instant the watchers on the great house gallery, if any had dared to watch, would have seen her speak 3 words no wind carried away. Then she too was gone. By 5 o'clock the storm had rolled east toward New Orleans, leaving a sky washed clean and pink with dawn. The cane stood straight again. The yard was pristine mud, no footprints, no blood, no broken iron. The cabin doors hung open and empty, pallets still warm from bodies that would never return. 40 tin pans sat neatly aligned where supper had been eaten. 40 voices had been singing Celeste's lullaby. 40 hearts had beaten in terror. And 40 human beings, men, women, children, the old, the strong, the sick, the dreaming, had ceased to exist as completely as smoke in a hurricane. When Josiah Rankin stumbled out an hour later, hungover and cursing the weather, he took one look at the empty quarters and vomited into the cane. He ran to the great house screaming that the devil himself had come calling. Mr. Henry, cold sober in his dressing gown, walked the yard himself, eyes flicking over every inch of mud, every broken hasp, every shackle snapped like clay. He found the circle, already fading under the rising sun, and the single heart now shrunken and black. He stared at it for a long time, no one dared interrupt. Then he ordered the heart burned, the quarters locked forever, and every mouth on the place sworn to silence on pain of death. But silence could not explain the total absence of footprints in fresh mud, could not explain metal bent by no human hand, could not explain how 40 people locked inside bolted doors vanished without a trace, while the rest of the world slept. The night of August 17, 1848, took them, and whatever took them left only broken chains swinging gently in the morning breeze, dripping red in the new light, and a silence deeper than any grave. Dawn on August 18, 1848, broke pale and merciless over Belle Grove. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean, and the sun rose like a hot coin pressed against the retina. Steam rose from the cane leaves in shimmering curtains. The air smelled of wet earth, bruised vegetation, and something else, something coppery that clung to the back of the throat and refused to be swallowed away. Josiah Rankin was the first white man to reach the quarters. He had spent the night in the overseer's house drinking off a 3-day binge, and when he staggered out to piss against a wagon wheel, the silence struck him harder than any scream could have. No horn had blown, no bell had rung, no child cried, no pots clattered. Just the soft drip of leftover rain from the eaves, and the slow, deliberate creak of 40 empty cabin doors hanging open like slack jaws. Rankin's boots made the only footprints in the yard. He walked the full length of both rows, lantern still in hand though the sun was already high enough to hurt the eyes, and he counted empty pallets, empty tin cups, empty shackles lying in the mud like dead snakes. 40 sets, 40 exactly. When he reached the blood circle, the vomit came so suddenly he had no time to turn his head. It spattered across his own boots and mixed with the dark, glossy stain that was already beginning to crust at the edges. He ran then, slipping and cursing, up the long oak avenue to the great house. Mr. Henry Whitmore met him on the gallery, still in his silk dressing gown, a cup of coffee in one hand, and the New Orleans Picayune folded to the racing results in the other. Rankin tried to speak and could only point back toward the quarters, his face the color of tallow. Henry set the cup down without a word, took a pistol from the hall table, and walked the distance himself. He moved slowly, the way a man walks across thin ice, eyes flicking over every inch of ground as though the mud might suddenly open and confess. What he saw froze even him. No tracks, not one. The yard was virgin soft after the rain, yet the only prints were the ones Rankin had just made and now Henry's own. The cabin doors stood open, hasps twisted outward as if something inside had pushed, not something outside pulling. Every padlock lay in 2 or 3 feet away. The hasps snapped clean. Henry picked one up, tested the break with his thumb. The iron was thick as his wrist, forged in Pittsburgh. A blacksmith's sledge might have done it, but 40 of them, silently, in minutes? Impossible. Inside the cabins, the pallets were still depressed where bodies had lain only hours before. Some still held the warmth of sleep. A baby's rag doll lay half under one blanket, one button eye staring at the roof. On a rough table, someone had left a half-finished cornrow braid of a little girl's hair, the ends still damp with coconut oil. Henry lifted the braid, smelled it, and let it fall as though it burned. He walked the full circle of blood last. By now the sun had dried the surface to a black lacquer. At the center lay the heart, shrunken overnight to the size of a fist, the color of a spoiled liver. Flies had found it already. Henry stared for a long time. Then he drew his pistol, thumbed back the hammer, and shot the heart twice. The reports rolled across the cane like small thunder. Pieces of it spattered outward, but even destroyed it kept its perfect placement, as though the circle refused to be broken. Only then did he allow himself one sentence, spoken so low that Rankin 10 feet away almost missed it. "They are gone." Word raced upriver and downriver faster than any steamboat. By noon, the sheriff of East Baton Rouge Parish, Auguste Dubroil, arrived with 6 deputies and 20 volunteers, rode in under a white flag of curiosity and dread. By 2 o'clock, the yard was crowded with white men in broad hats and linen suits, pipes clenched in teeth, eyes wide. They walked the rows, poked at the broken shackles with riding crops, measured the blood circle with boot heels. Some laughed too loudly. Some crossed themselves, though they were Protestant. A doctor from town, Claude Godefroy, knelt by the ruined heart and pronounced it human, adult, probably male, torn out by a force I cannot explain without invoking either wild beasts or the devil himself. Mr. Henry stood on the gallery the entire time, motionless, hands clasped behind his back. When Sheriff Dubroil finally climbed the steps, hat in hand, Henry spoke first. "They rose up," he said, voice flat as a judge's gavel. "Killed my overseers in their beds, broke their chains and fled into the swamp. The blood is from the fight. You'll want to organize a hunt before they reach the Maroons in the Atchafalaya." Dubroil was a cautious man who owed his office to sugar money. He glanced once toward the empty quarters, once at the pistol on Henry's hip, and nodded slowly. That was the story that went out to the world. Within 48 hours, every newspaper from Baton Rouge to Mobile carried some version of it. Terrible Negro insurrection at Belle Grove Plantation. 40 slaves murder overseers and vanish into the cypress swamps. Bloodbath discovered at dawn. Posse forming. The New Orleans Delta printed an extra with a woodcut of snarling black figures wielding cane knives under a full moon. The Baton Rouge Gazette assured its readers that the miscreants cannot long evade justice, and praised Mr. Henry Whitmore for his calmness in the face of savagery. Rewards were posted, $50 for every runaway returned alive, $100 for every one dead, no questions asked about the condition of the corpse. Search parties rode out at first light on the 19th, 130 men, half of them professional slave catchers with dogs bred in Cuba for one purpose. They carried lanterns, rifles, bullwhips, and bottles of whiskey to keep the fear down. They beat the cane fields until the leaves fell like green rain. They dragged the bayous with chains. They burned maroon camps they found empty. The dogs worked themselves into frenzy, then into exhaustion, then into something close to madness. By the 3rd day they refused to cross a certain slough no matter how their handlers whipped them. The animals simply lay down in the mud and whined, ears flat, tails tucked. The search lasted 9 days. 9 days of heat, mosquitoes, and the smell of rotting vegetation. 9 days in which the only black people found were 2 ancient women living on a houseboat who swore they had seen nothing but the usual ghosts. On the 10th day, the posse came back to Belle Grove filthy, bitten raw, half-drunk, and utterly empty-handed. Not one footprint, not one shred of cloth, not one drop of blood beyond the original circle, which Henry had ordered plowed under and sown with salt. And that was when the official story began to crack like old porcelain. First came the small lies that refused to line up. The overseers, it was claimed, had been murdered in their beds, but Josiah Rankin was alive, unshaven and shaking, drinking himself blind in the stables. The other 5 overseers were found exactly where they had fallen asleep, one still snoring with an empty jug on his chest. When questioned, Rankin babbled about a green light in the cane and locks opening by themselves. Henry paid him $50 and sent him upriver on the next steamboat with orders never to return to Louisiana on pain of death. Rankin was seen once more, years later, in a Memphis grog shop, missing 3 fingers and telling anyone who would listen that the ground itself ate them. Next came the dogs that would not track. Every handler agreed. The hounds hit the edge of the blood circle and stopped as though they had run into a wall. Some pissed themselves. Some tried to bite their masters and had to be shot. One animal, a famous brute named Satan, who had run down more runaways than any dog in the state, clawed his own throat out with his hind legs, rather than take another step toward the quarters. Then there were the shackles. Blacksmiths were brought from Baton Rouge, from Donaldsonville, even one from New Orleans who had forged cannon for Andrew Jackson. They examined the broken iron under magnifying lenses. Every man reached the same conclusion: the metal had not been cut, filed, or heated. It had been snapped by pressure so sudden and so enormous that the grain of the iron had flowed like cold taffy. One smith, a German named Klein, calculated that it would take the jaws of the largest steam hammer in Pittsburgh to do the same to a single link, let alone 40. When he announced his findings in a tavern that night, he was beaten senseless by persons unknown and left the parish before sunrise. The blood circle itself defied every test. Dr. Godefroy took samples in glass vials. Within hours, the blood had congealed into a black jelly that smoked when touched with a lancet. By the 3rd day, it had turned to ash without burning. Chemists at the medical college in New Orleans could not identify the substance. It contained iron, yes, but also traces of something they hesitantly called organic sulfur, in quantities that should have stunk of rotten eggs yet somehow smelled only of deep, wet earth after a grave is opened. And finally, most damning of all, there was the absence of flight. Every slave catcher knew the signs of a mass escape: trampled cane, broken branches, discarded rags, footprints in the soft ground, food stolen from the kitchen, boats taken from the landing. Here there was nothing. The kitchen was untouched, the smokehouse locked, every bateau still tied to the wharf with dew on the oars. The main gate, which Henry swore had been forced, showed no mark on the ironwork. The lock was rusted shut exactly as it had been for years. Even the Maroons in the deep swamp, who would normally have welcomed 40 new fighters, sent word through back channels that no strangers had come to them. Not one. By the end of August, the white community of Baton Rouge had quietly closed ranks. Publicly, the story remained insurrection and flight. Privately, men stopped riding past Belle Grove after dark. Mothers forbade children to play near the river road. The priest at St. Joseph's refused to consecrate the ground where the quarters stood. When Henry Whitmore advertised for new laborers, not a single soul applied, not even the desperate Irish fresh off the coffin's ships. The cane crop of 1848 was the richest in the parish's history, yet every hogshead that left the mill seemed heavier with something no scale could measure. Years later, when the first cracks of war began to show in the Republic, old men in Baton Rouge taverns would still lower their voices to speak of the night the 40 vanished. They spoke of locks that opened themselves, of dogs that howled at the ground instead of the sky, of iron that broke like sugar candy, of a circle of blood that refused to wash away, until Henry himself scattered it with his bare hands and cursed the earth in a language no one recognized. The official story, insurrection, murder, escape, held in newspapers and court records and the memories white men allowed themselves in daylight. But every black nursemaid who rocked a white child to sleep in Baton Rouge knew the truth was something older than chains had come to collect a debt. And the land of Belle Grove, sated for a season, kept its silence like a well-fed animal licking its lips, waiting for the next payment to fall due. The story that white Baton Rouge told itself in daylight was one thing. The story that black Baton Rouge whispered after the lamps were turned low was something else entirely. It began in the kitchens and the washhouses, in the market stalls where free women of color sold callous and gossip, in the hidden corners of Congo Square when the drums were silent and only the old people spoke. It passed from mouth to ear like a coal carried in bare hands, careful, quick, burning. Children were sent out of the room when it began, yet every child knew the shape of it before they were 10 years old. Grown men who had stared down overseers and patrollers without flinching felt their throats close when the tale reached its center. Because this was not a story about cruelty. Cruelty they understood. This was a story about appetite. They called it the taking of the 40. The first telling most people ever heard came from a woman named Maman Leroux, a free traiteur who lived in a small brick house behind the Spanish Town Road. She was old enough that her skin had turned the color of river silt, and her eyes were the pale gray of wood ash. On All Saints' Night of 1848, she gathered 20 of the oldest survivors of Belle Grove, people who had been sold away before the vanishing, or who had been in the sick house that night, and made them sit in a circle around her hearth. She burned sage and graveyard dirt, poured rum for the dead, and told them they must speak everything they knew before the year turned. What she coaxed out of them that night became the spine of the whispered truth. It began, they said, long before the Whitmores. The land itself was already old when the first French soldiers stuck a flag in it. Tunica burial mounds rose in slow humps along the river. The people had been laid there with shell beads and red ochre 1,000 years before Christ walked. When the Spanish came, they plowed through one of the mounds to build a fort, and found bones so large they swore they belonged to giants. The bones were thrown into the river. That night, every dog in the garrison tore out its own throat. The Spanish abandoned the post within a month. The French who came later were warned by the Huma and the Kirimacha never to dig there again, never to spill blood on that ground after sundown. The French laughed, bought the land cheap, and planted indigo. The indigo failed. Every leaf blackened overnight as though burned by invisible fire. The French sold to an Englishman named Harrow who tried rice. The rice grew tall and beautiful, then sank into the earth like it was being pulled from below. Harrow's wife and all 7 children died of a wasting sickness that left them smiling in their beds. Harrow hanged himself from the live oak that still stands in front of where the great house would later rise. His body spun for 3 days before anyone dared cut it down, and every morning the rope was wet with fresh blood though the corpse was dry. Then came the Whitmores. Henry Whitmore's grandfather, Elias, bought the cursed acres in 1794, with money made running slaves out of Barbados. Elias was different from the other planters. He kept no chaplain, attended no church, and was rumored to own books bound in something softer than calfskin. On the night he took possession, he walked the boundaries alone, carrying a lantern that burned green. Old Jules, the enslaved coachman who drove him there, swore the flame was the color of absinthe, and never flickered though the wind was strong enough to tear the hat from his head. At each corner post Elias buried a small bundle wrapped in red flannel. Jules saw him press something that looked like a dried flesh into the dirt before covering it. That same night Jules's wife gave birth to a child with no eyes. Elias paid Jules a Spanish dollar to keep silent and sold mother and child downriver before the week was out. Sugar finally grew where indigo and rice had failed, grew so thick and sweet that men said the cane seeds scattered on a grave would sprout by morning. The Whitmores prospered beyond reason. But every 7 years, on the turning of the cycle, something was required. A life. Not just any life, an innocent given willingly or taken with perfect cruelty. The first payment was Elias's own daughter, age 9, who fell from the gallery in 1801. The second was his wife, who drowned in 3 inches of bathwater in 1808. By the time Henry inherited in 1831, the debt had become a habit. House servants whispered that certain infants born on the place simply disappeared from their cradles, their mothers waking with milk-heavy breasts and empty arms. Runaways were never sold away. They were kept for the night the cycle turned again. But Henry Whitmore was ambitious. He wanted more than mere wealth. He wanted dominion. In 1841 he traveled to New Orleans and sought out Marie Laveau, not the public Marie of the square and the tourist tales, but the private one who kept a house on Rue de Rempart with no number on the door. She refused him at first. He came a second time with a lock of his own hair, a vial of his blood, and the pinky finger of his sleeping son Absalom, cut off without waking the boy. Marie took the offerings, looked into Henry's eyes, and told him the price would be 40 souls given all at once, no substitutions, no partial payment. Henry smiled the way a wolf smiles and said he would deliver. He spent the next 7 years preparing. He bought the strongest, healthiest slaves he could find, men and women in the prime of life, children just reaching working age, so the offering would be perfect. He worked them mercilessly not only for sugar but to season their despair, to ripen it. Every cruelty, every whipping, every night in the breaker, every child sold away from its mother was a drop of marinade. Tante Marguerite felt it first. She told the others the ground was drinking, slow sips through the soles of their feet while they slept. She tried to warn them, tried to make protective packets of graveyard dirt and asafoetida, but Henry had her watched. When she began drawing Vives in the dirt with a stick, he had her beaten until her back was hamburger and her tongue swelled so she could not speak the old words. On the night the debt came due, the storm was not weather. It was a mouth opening. The thing that rose beneath the cane fields had no name in any human tongue. Some of the old Africans called it Baron Cimetier's black horse, others the root that eats. Tante Marguerite, in the few lucid hours before the end, called it simply the first hunger. It had been here before the mounds, before the red men or white, before the great lizards walked. It slept beneath the river bend and woke only when the proper bargain was struck. Blood called it. Despair fed it. 40 perfect souls, offered without resistance, because resistance had already been whipped and starved and raped out of them, would sate it for a long, long time. That is why there were no footprints. The hunger did not walk on top of the earth, it opened the earth and took what belonged to it. The cold was the breath from its throat, the broken shackles were a signature, metal could not withstand the pressure of its closing fist. The heart in the circle was not from any of the 40, it was a receipt, left the way a traveler might leave a coin on a windowsill to show the room had been used. Tante Marguerite knew the moment the bargain snapped shut. That is why she stood smiling in the rain. She had tried to cheat the bargain one last time. In the weeks before, she had quietly marked every person in the quarters with a tiny cross of ash on the sole of the left foot, an old Congo trick to make the dead pass you by. But Henry had smelled the wood smoke on her, had her feet scrubbed raw with lye until the crosses were gone. She knew then the 40 would go clean. Her smile was for the small mercy that the children would not suffer long. The 40 did not die screaming. They were unmade gently, the way a mother lifts a sleeping child from a bed and carries it into the dark. One moment they were simply elsewhere, folded into the hunger's belly where time is different and pain is only a flavor. Their bodies never hit the ground. Their blood never spilled except for the single heart that was politely returned. Henry Whitmore watched from the upper gallery. He had been told to witness and he obeyed. When the last soul, Tante Marguerite, was taken, he felt something brush past him, cold and wet as river water, smelling of turned earth and old bones. It paused long enough for him to understand that the bargain had been accepted, then it was gone. The cane straightened. The temperature rose. The storm moved on toward the Gulf as though nothing had happened. For 11 more years Henry prospered beyond dreams. The sugar was sweeter, the hogsheads heavier, the prices higher. His wife descended fully into laudanum and never came out. His son Absalom grew tall and strange, speaking to empty rooms, drawing circles of salt around his bed at night. Henry began to age backward, or so people said, hair darkening, eyes brightening, wounds healing overnight. He laughed at the rumors and bought more land, more slaves, more time. Then in 1859 the great house burned. They said it was a spark from a slave in the kitchen. They said lightning. They said spontaneous combustion of the sugar dust in the mill. But those who ran to the fire saw something else, flames the color of absinthe, leaping higher than physics allowed, and in the middle of the inferno the figure of Henry Whitmore standing untouched, arms outstretched as though welcoming an old friend. When the roof fell in, he did not scream. He simply wasn't there anymore. The plantation was never rebuilt. The land passed through many hands, none of them able to hold it long. Cane grew wild and sharp as saws, cattle sickened, surveyors lost their compasses spin like tops. In 1881 a company from Ohio tried to drain the backfields and found human bones too large to belong to any known race, tangled in roots that bled when cut. The company went bankrupt within a year. And still the story lived. Every 7 years, on the anniversary of the taking, people living within 10 miles of the old Belgrove site report the same things. Chains dragging across empty fields long after the last slave died. 40 voices singing a lullaby in a language no one remembers. Cold spots where frost forms in August. The smell of wet earth rising from ground that has not seen rain in weeks. Hunters' dogs refuse to cross the property line. Children wake screaming that something tall and jointed wrong is standing at the foot of their beds counting, 1, 2, 3, up to 40. Then starting over, the old people say the bargain was never finished. Henry Whitmore paid with 40 souls, but he tried to cheat on the final clause, his own. When he refused to walk into the fire willingly, the first hunger took the house instead, and him with it, but the debt rolled forward. Interest, they call it, compound interest in blood and despair. They say it is still hungry. They say the next payment will not be 40%, it will be the parish. And when the sky turns that particular green just before a storm that comes from no direction on any map, the old ones lock their doors, salt their thresholds, and pray that the hunger passes over them the way death once passed over doorposts painted with lamb's blood. Because some bargains, once struck, do not end with the death of the man who made them, they only grow teeth. The ruins of Belle Grove Plantation lie silent now, swallowed by the Louisiana wilds that have reclaimed what man once tamed. It is 2025, and the land where 7,000 acres once bloomed with sugar cane is a forgotten scar on the map, overgrown with kudzu vines thick as pythons, cypress knees pushing up through cracked flagstones, and live oaks whose branches twist like arthritic fingers pointing accusations at the sky. The great house is gone, reduced to a few crumbling brick piers and scattered shards of imported porcelain that crunch underfoot like brittle bones. The sugar mill's foundation, a vast concrete rectangle pocked with rusting iron bolts, serves as a playground for feral cats and the occasional coyote that slinks in from the river levees. Drone footage from modern explorers shows the site from above, a perfect rectangle of cleared earth amid the encroaching swamp, as though the land itself refuses to let anything grow there permanently. Surveyors' stakes from failed development attempts in the 1990s still poke through the weeds, their orange ribbons long since faded to pink ghosts fluttering in the breeze. The fire that consumed Belle Grove came on the night of April 12, 1859, 11 years and 8 months after the taking. It started in the kitchen, or so the official report claimed, a spark from the cook stove igniting a pile of oily rags. But those who lived nearby, the few remaining tenant farmers scratching out a living on the edges of the property, swore differently. They spoke of flames that leaped from the ground itself, green-tinged and hungry, racing up the columns of the great house like liquid fire poured from heaven. The blaze was visible for miles, a pillar of smoke twisting into the shape of a hand reaching for the stars. By dawn, the mansion was ash. The mill, the barns, the overseer's quarters, all gone. Only the slave cabins remained, standing untouched amid the char, their doors still hanging open as though waiting for occupants who would never return. Henry Whitmore was never found. His body, if there was one, had vanished into the inferno. Some said they saw him in the heart of the flames, arms raised in surrender or triumph, his silk dressing gown untouched by soot. The insurance adjusters from New Orleans arrived within days, poking through the rubble with gloved hands and notebooks. They noted the absence of human remains. No bones, no teeth, no scraps of clothing. The fire had burned hot enough to melt glass, but left the silverware in the dining room drawer intact and polished. The adjusters whispered among themselves about arson, but Henry had no enemies wealthy enough to bribe the entire parish. The policy paid out handsomely, over $50,000, enough to rebuild twice over, but the land itself seemed cursed. Prospective buyers came from as far as Charleston and Richmond, drawn by the bargain price, but each left within hours. One man from Mobile claimed his horse bolted at the gate and threw him into the mud. A woman from Natchez fainted dead away on the gallery ruins, babbling about whispers in the wind. By 1860, the property sat abandoned, taxes unpaid, claimed by the state in foreclosure. The Civil War came soon after, and Belle Grove became just another forgotten corner of a divided South. For over a century, the land lay fallow. Weeds grew taller than men, hiding the blood circle that had once marked the center of the yard. Local children dared each other to venture onto the property, emerging with tales of cold spots that froze their breath in July, of chains rattling in empty air. In the 1920s, a bootlegger named Remy Delacroix tried to use the old mill foundation as a still site. His men set up copper coils and mash vats, but on the first night the equipment vanished, coils twisted into impossible knots, vats upended with no footprints in the soft earth. Delacroix himself disappeared after insisting he heard 40 voices singing in the dark. His body was found weeks later in the Mississippi, bloated and unmarked, his eyes wide open as though he had seen something too terrible for death to erase. The Great Depression brought scavengers. Poor families from Baton Rouge stripped the remaining bricks for chimneys, pulled iron spikes from the foundation for scrap. One man, digging for rumored buried silver, unearthed a small bundle wrapped in red flannel, the same kind Elias Whitmore had buried generations before. Inside was a lock of hair, a vial of dried blood, and a finger bone. The digger laughed it off until that night, when his dreams filled with the sensation of being pulled downward through cold mud, his lungs filling with earth. He sold the bundle to a museum in New Orleans, where it sits today in a locked case labeled 19th Century Plantation Artifact, provenance unknown. The digger hanged himself a month later from the same live oak that had held Elias Whitmore's body. World War II saw the land drafted for use. The Army Corps of Engineers considered it for a training ground, swamp maneuvers for soldiers bound for the Pacific. Bulldozers cleared the overgrowth, revealing the perfect rectangle of the old yard. The blood circle now a faint depression in the soil. On the first night of surveying, the crew heard it. Chains dragging across concrete, faint at first, then louder, accompanied by the soft shuffle of bare feet. Sentries reported shapes moving between the cypress trees, tall, emaciated figures with eyes like burning coals. The project was abandoned within a week, the official reason cited as unstable soil conditions. Unofficially, the commanding officer wrote in his journal, "The ground rejects us, it hungers." The post-war boom brought the first serious attempt at redevelopment. In 1952, a consortium of Baton Rouge businessmen formed the Belle Grove Land Company, envisioning a subdivision, neat ranch houses with white picket fences, a golf course winding through the old cane fields, perhaps a country club where the great house once stood. Surveyors staked out lots, engineers tested the soil. The first core sample came up black and oily, smelling of decay. The second hit something hard, a layer of iron shards, thousands of them, broken links from shackles, scattered like confetti across an acre. The third sample was blood, fresh red blood that dripped from the drill bit though the ground was dry. Drilling stopped. The consortium dissolved amid rumors of hauntings. One engineer, a Korean War veteran named Harlan Tate, quit the field entirely after waking one morning to find his tent surrounded by a perfect circle of salt, the kind used to ward off spirits in old Creole rituals. The 1960s and 70s saw the land left to nature, a nature that grew vicious. Kudzu smothered everything, vines wrapping around remaining bricks until they crumbled. Feral hogs rooted up the soil, unearthing bones, not human, but too large, too curved to belong to any known animal. Hunters who ventured in for the hogs never returned the same. One man, a Vietnam vet named Bobby Ray, emerged after 3 days babbling about the count, 40 voices chanting numbers in the dark, getting closer each time. He shot himself in a motel room off Highway 61, leaving a note, "They want 40 more. The land remembers." Environmentalists in the 1980s tried to turn it into a wildlife preserve. Biologists cataloged the unusual flora, cane that grew without water, flowers that bloomed only at midnight with petals black as ink. Ornithologists noted birds avoiding the site entirely, even during migration. But when they set up cameras, the footage showed anomalies. Shadows moving against the wind, figures that resolved into human shapes when enhanced. One tape captured audio, a lullaby, faint and ethereal, sung by a voice like Celeste's from 1848. The project was shelved when funding mysteriously dried up. The grant administrator who approved it died in a car accident the next week, his vehicle veering into a tree with no skid marks. The 1990s brought the developers again, this time with heavy machinery. A Houston-based firm bought the land cheap, planning luxury condos overlooking the river. Bulldozers scraped away the kudzu, revealing the blood circle perfectly preserved, not a blade of grass growing within its 10-foot diameter. Concrete was poured for foundations, but overnight the slabs cracked as though struck from below. Rebar bent into circles. Workers quit en masse after tools vanished and reappeared arranged in patterns. 40 rocks in a ring, 40 nails driven into a tree in the shape of a heart. The foreman, a no-nonsense Texan named Buck Harlan, pressed on until he found himself alone in the site at dusk. He described it later in a lawsuit. The ground trembled, cold air rising from cracks that opened like mouths, and 40 shadows rose around him, each whispering his name. He fled, sold his shares at a loss, and moved to Arizona, where he never spoke of Louisiana again. The turn of the millennium saw ghost hunters and paranormal investigators descend. Teams from LSU and Tulane set up EMF meters, infrared cameras, EVP recorders. They captured orbs of light dancing over the ruins, voices on tape reciting names: Rose, Celeste, Isaac, Marguerite. One psychic, a woman from New Orleans named Evangeline Thibodeau, entered the site blindfolded and emerged screaming, her hands marked with 40 perfect burns in the shape of shackle links. She claimed the land was a thin place where the veil between worlds had torn in 1848, and something ancient still fed there. Her report: "It's not ghosts, it's hunger. The earth itself is alive and starving." Today, in 2025, the site remains untouched. No trespassing signs from the 1950s still hang crooked on rusted posts, enforced not by law but by local lore. Realtors in Baton Rouge won't list it. Surveyors refuse jobs there. Drone pilots who fly over report their batteries draining inexplicably. Footage glitching with static that sounds like chains rattling. Hunters from nearby parishes tell of dogs going mad at the boundary, turning on their owners or bolting into the swamp never to return. Every August 17th, when thunder rolls in from nowhere, residents miles away bolt their doors. They hear it: the dragging chains, the faint screams carried on the wind, the low thump of something awakening beneath the soil. The cover-up holds because it must. Official records burned with the house, but fragments survive in dusty archives. A coroner's report noting, "No bodies recovered." A sheriff's log entry crossed out but still legible. "Unnatural causes suspected." Historians dismiss it as mass hysteria or secret escape to freedom, but those who dig deeper find the pattern. Every owner since Whitmore met ruin. Bankruptcies, madness, mysterious deaths. The land is toxic to ambition, rejecting development like a body rejects a transplant. Yet whispers persist. In Baton Rouge bars, old men lean close over whiskey and murmur about the debt unpaid. In churches, preachers warn of ancient evils tied to the soil. Children play games called 40 Gone, where one kid hides and the others count to 40 before searching, but the hidden one is always found smiling strangely, as though they've seen something wonderful and terrible. The ruins stand as a warning. Abandoned, yes, but not empty. The land waits, patient as the river that flows past it, counting the years. Hunters swear their dogs go crazy and run, tail tucked, whining like puppies. The air thickens on August nights, thunder rumbling from clear skies. And in the quiet moments, when the wind dies, you can almost hear it. 40 chains dragging across empty fields, 40 screams fading into the bayou mist. So the mystery endures, buried in the earth that swallowed it, waiting for the next fool to disturb its rest. The cover-up isn't just history, it's survival. Because some truths, once uncovered, don't let you go. They take you whole, leaving only broken chains and silence behind.